Hi everyone, I just wanted to do a pumpkin painting with you all today. So we're going to have a go at doing it in just watercolour. I picked these up in the supermarket this week and they're super cute, really tiny as you can see, but they're going to be perfect for doing some painting. So I've laid out everything here so you can see what I'm using. We're going to start off by sketching an outline and then I'll talk you through the colours, how to mix them and hopefully create a nice sort of realistic looking watercolour. So the things that you're going to need, we've got some watercolour paper here. This is just some Daler Rowney cold press paper. Make sure if you're using just supplies you've got at home, make sure that it's a slightly thicker paper, just so it doesn't start to warp and out as you put water on it. We've got just a jar of water, nice clean water. I've got some tissue so I can wipe off my brushes. I've got my mixing palette. I've got the colours that we're going to be using here, and I'll put the list of these onto the video so you can see what colours I'll be using, but I'll talk you through them as we go. I've also got pencil and a rubber to use for obviously sketching out our design, and then I've got two brushes that we're going to be using today. I've got Cotman brushes, which are watercolour synthetic brushes. I've got a number 4, which is perfect for doing like the bigger areas when you're painting, and then I've got a 10-0, which is quite small as you can see, but it's perfect for getting those really nice details on there. So the first thing we're going to have a go at doing then is sketching an outline for the pumpkin. So I'm going to do this freehand, but let me know in the comments if it would be handy for you to have maybe an outline or something linked on there so you can actually use that at home, and I can do a separate video to explain to you how to transfer the image actually onto the paper before you start painting. So to begin with, I'm just going to kind of sketch the outline of the little pumpkin in front of me. Now I'm going to do this one here because I really like, hopefully you can see it on the camera, but I really like the actual colours that are on here. We've got like the oranges and you've got yellows and that going on as well, which look really, really nice. So I'm going to just get an outline roughly on there. When I do the watercolours, you can just go ahead and go for it when you're actually doing your paintings. I personally like to kind of sketch an outline to begin with. I just think it gives you something to kind of work from then. And also it helps you with your composition on the page. So it helps you to be able to see where everything goes. Will it fit? You know, if you start a picture and it just ends up being too big and won't actually fit on your page, then obviously, you know, by the time you get to kind of here, sadly, you're going to have part of your picture that's been cut off. So if you sketch it out to begin with, it just gives you an opportunity then to ensure that you've got everything in your picture that you want, that you're happy with the size, and then you can go in there with your paints. Now, a nice thing, I use a graphite pencil to do this. Now the pencil I'm using is B. Now I can do a separate video on different types of pencils and that to use if you think that that would be handy. So do let me know in the comments if you think it will be useful to do that. And I can explain to you the different types of pencils and how to use them and what works best for sketching out, what works best when you're doing watercolours. You'll find that if you're using quite dark colours when you're doing your watercolour painting, a lot of your pencil marks will be covered up anyway. So you won't see a lot of this. So don't worry if you're thinking, oh gosh, you know, I'm going to be able to see all the sketching that I've done previously on my pumpkin before I've started my picture, because you won't. So if you're doing darker colours, that is, it'll cover it. If not, I'll show you as we go along how you can kind of remove those pencil lines before you put your watercolours, or as you're painting as we go along, and then you'll be able to see how to remove those. So you won't see any pencil marks once you get your painting on there. So to begin with, the way watercolours work is usually, the way I paint with them anyway, is I usually start light to dark. It's a lot easier to layer darker colours over the top of light as opposed to the other way around. There are ways of doing it, but it can be a bit tricky. So the first thing I'm going to do is start to get some of these yellowy kind of tones and that underneath before we put the orange on. So I'm going to mix my colours up. Now I use half pans. You can buy tubes, very, very similar, but I personally like to use half pans when I'm painting. And I'm going to start off, and I always start off by mixing my colours to begin with. So I've got my nice blank palette here, and I'm going to get some nice colours going on. So I've got a lovely yellow colour. Now I'm using Winsor & Newton watercolours here, but if you've got other brands at home, don't feel you have to use the same brands that I do. I personally just really like the colours. I've been using them for many, many years. So I've found that they work well for me. Some people prefer to use tubes rather than using half pans, and that's absolutely fine. It's just personal preference, really. They're good for different things. But I like to actually use the half pans. I've always found that they've got the results that I wanted. So I've just stuck with them, basically. And when I do a lot of my classes that are face-to-face as well, I always use half pans, and I teach with half pans as well. But again, I have some students that come to my classes and they've got tubes, and that's absolutely fine. You know, you can use the tubes. I will put the names of the paints that I'm using in the actual comment section, in the bio part attached to this, but don't feel that you're restricted to have to use the brand. You know, if you've got a set of paints at home that belong to a different brand or that, just go with a colour that's very similar to what I'm using, and you'll be able to get the same kind of result. So I know sometimes when you watch videos and that, you think that you have to have the exact same kit as the person that's painting, and sometimes that's true, sometimes it's true, but not always. So don't feel that you have to use exactly the same as what I'm using in the actual videos. So what I'm doing here is I'm just laying out my colours. So I've activated them. So basically what I mean by that is I've just put water on them. They're not a permanent paint. So as soon as you put water on them, it activates the colour, which is lovely. I like them as well because there's a lot less waste to other painting media as well, which I quite like. So I've got a nice bright yellow, I've got an orange on here, black, I've gone with a yellow ochre, which is like a mustardy yellow, a nice bit of green, and then I've got the white here. Now because my paint, I had a little bit of paint on my brush, it's got a bit of a light greeny colour, but that's fine. Okay, that's fine for what we're doing. So the first thing I'm going to do is get some base colours on here, and I'm going to use a little bit of yellow with a bit of the orange, and I always apply dark to light colours. I find if you try and do it the other way around, you'll use a lot more paint to try and get the shades that you want. And when I paint in really thin layers of paint, and I find then that I can build them up over time and create a darker colour. So to begin with on the pumpkin here, I'm just going to start introducing some of this lovely yellowy orange kind of colour on the base. Now don't worry that you can see those pencil marks, because as we paint we can get rid of those, and I'll show you how to do that. So to begin with, I'm just going to introduce a little bit of this lovely light, and you can see it's very pale, it's very watery. That's why I wanted to make sure that my palette was on the screen for you to see. So it's quite watery, but you'll see the more you add, the darker it gets. So for example, I've gone on here, now I haven't got much left on my brush, it's gone on just about, but you see the minute I dip in the same colour, so I've not mixed it any differently, and reapply, see how it's gone slightly darker, and you can apply a different shade then over the top. Now what's quite handy when you're doing a pumpkin is it's broken into sections, like a Terry's orange. So you've broken into sections so you can work on it section at a time. And the lovely thing with watercolours is if you use them all wet together, they kind of blend into one another, and you see you've got this lovely kind of ripply effect going on the actual pumpkin. We can mimic that with the actual watercolours. So whilst these are still very slightly damp on the page, I'm going to get a little bit more of the darker orange, and start dabbing that on and introducing it. Now here I've put it on and it's a bit too strong, so all I do is just wash off my brush to get rid of the paint that's on there, and I'm just using it slightly damp, and I'm gonna, whilst it's wet, start to move around that colour. Now one thing to remember with watercolours is as they dry, they do dry slightly darker, so don't panic too much when you put it on there. Half the fun when I love painting, I do, I really love it. I find it very therapeutic, and I find half the fun is actually just applying different colours and seeing how it turns out, seeing what happens. And I think that's kind of what is quite fun about using watercolours, is it's like you're never quite sure how it's going to really turn out, and I think that's quite good fun to do that. So I've added a little bit of dark on top, and I'm just going to put back on, I'm going to mix a little bit more. So we've got to start with the yellow, put a little bit of the orange into it to make that slightly more paler colour, and then reapply it. Now I could do with a little bit more yellow in there. Now that's a bit better, matches a bit more the colour that was on previously. And I'm going to put that base colour on all the way around these last few sections. And you can see there the yellow's gone on quite strong, but as soon as I start just adding water to it, see how it lightens the colour? And then I can move it around the page and put it in the places I want it to actually be. Now I'm going to get a little bit more of this orange and start dabbing that in. Now because there's this kind of like dappled patterning on the actual pumpkin, I'm going to mimic that when I'm actually painting. So I'm going to dab it on rather than doing really lovely neat paint strokes. See how I'm dabbing on that colour, and it gives you that lovely mottled effect then as I'm adding it. But because the paint underneath that I've already put on is slightly damp, it's starting to blend the two colours and shades together. And you can see, like here for example, it's really starting to blend those shades together nicely for you. And if you feel, oh actually it's a bit too light, go back over it, add a little bit more. Now you can see here, because it's quite wet, see how when I put the colour on it's dispersing, it's kind of disappearing. If you want to have more distinct edges like on here, just let that bottom layer dry a bit and then put the colour over the top, and you'll find it won't start blending together so much. So I'm going to carry on layering. So this is like our base layer, this is nice and light colour. We're going to go darker on this now, and you'll find that I let one layer dry before I put the next layer on top, but you'll see this is still a bit damp, but because I've left this a few minutes and it's like normal room temperature here, so it's drying quite quickly. So I'm now going to add another layer, and I'm going to add some other shades to this. So I'm going to go a little bit more orange in with the original colour that I mixed, and I'm going to add a little bit of this yellow ochre, and it's just going to give it a bit more of a kind of earthy colour and tone to the little pumpkin with the same brush. And I'm going to add this in around, and I'm going to really focus on the edges of the pumpkin on here. Now I'm getting it on, and then what I'm going to do is just with a damp brush, so I've washed off the paint that was on my brush, and I'm just going to now start blending that round like so. Get a little bit more paint. I'm going to start from the back here, and you can still dab it on to get that nice speckly dappled effect. Take off the excess and then move around and just blend it until you're happy with it really. And remember, you don't have to make your painting look exactly like mine. Part of the fun of being an artist is that you'll have your own style and your own way of applying paint and your own way of seeing colour. So don't feel, oh gosh, it doesn't look exactly like mine when it's finished, because no two paintings ever do. And that's kind of the nice thing about being an artist, really, isn't it? You know, you don't want everything to look like a carbon copy. It's nice to be able to have something that's unique and special to you because you made it. So I'm going to work my way around, keep adding it in, keep adding in those dappley areas into the pumpkin. So I'm mixing the yellow with the orange and a little bit of that ochre, working my way around. Like so. And now this area here is starting to dry nicely, so I can start layering up my colours a little bit more now without worrying about it merging together because the base layers are wet. So you can see here I'm getting more of that distinct line happening now. And it's really just a point of building it up until you're happy with it. Now, if you want it to be quite pale, like it is at the moment, brilliant. You can just kind of add in those finishing touches. If you want to keep going and make it a little bit darker and richer with the orange, because I work in very thin layers, for every layer I add, it will automatically get darker and darker each time. Because you're adding more pigment and you're adding more density to the colours that are there. And then it enables you to get a really nice orangey effect on here. Still putting in some of that dappley effect, as I think it looks quite nice. And I can see, like on the actual pumpkin itself, on where these little ridges are, I'm sure they've probably got a technical name. Put in the comments if you do know what the technical name if they are, or if they're actually just ridges. But you can see on here, I like to focus a little bit more of the paint on those ridges to really make them stand out more. And you find when you're doing a picture that darker colours will pop forward more and lighter colours will sink back more. And it's a really handy thing to remember when you're trying to create like the illusion of 3-dimension on the page. So I'm going to keep adding those colours and put in some of that really nice dapple two-tone effect that we've got going on the skin of the little pumpkin. And then I'm going to focus a little bit more around here. I think it's gone a bit darker here, and I quite like how it is actually. I don't know if I want to go a huge amount darker than what it is on here, but as I said, if you want to go a little bit darker, do. You know, these are your paintings. Feel free to add a little bit more. And remember as well, if you mixed your colours in the first place a little bit darker, it may well be darker than mine anyway. It's just that I use my colours quite watered down. So you might find that your colours are automatically a bit darker than mine. So I quite like that effect. I quite like what I've got there. So what I'm going to now do is switch over to my smaller brush. So this is my 10-0 brush. I have used a 3-0 brush before as well. When I do my classes, I often use a 3-0. And that is really nice. That's a nice size brush. I really like this finer edge on it. I think it looks really nice. And it gets lovely, lovely fine detail. And I like the detail. I really do like the detail. So what I'm doing here, I'm grabbing a little bit of the yellow ochre. And then I'm putting a tiny bit of black to it. I don't want to go in there with these darker areas, although they are quite shadowed. I don't want to use heavy black on it because I find that it just look too cartoony. It won't look as realistic, where the shadows are actually kind of dark grey, brown tones. So to make it fit in a bit better, and also using the colour palette that we've already got on the go, I'm using some of the yellow ochre tiny bit of black, and then I'm going to put a little bit of orange in there too. And it should hopefully give us a nice shadow effect that we're looking for, to put these nice details and these ridges and really make them pop even more. So I'm going to work my way around and slowly but surely put some of that shadow in. Now I think I might go a little bit darker than that actually. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit more, and you can see how watery my colours are, so you don't want them to be too thick. That's better. And we're going to add that in around some of these edges, give them a little bit of shadow in. Now we don't want to put it everywhere. I'm going to focus on what I can see. So what I'll do is I will put a photograph of the actual pumpkin I'm working from in the comments section attached to this video, and then you can, I'll see if I can anyway. It's my first video that I've ever done on here, so I'll see if I can attach it for you, and then hopefully you'll be able to then use the same pumpkin to paint from that I have. If not, it's currently the beginning of October, so at the moment, depending on when you're watching this video, it's a great time of year to nip down the shops and grab yourself a little pumpkin and to actually do something from life. Some of my artwork I do from photos, so it's quite nice sometimes to just do something from life for a change. So I'm just adding a tiny bit more black, so I'm going another tone down, and I'm going to go back over some of these areas and just add a little bit more darker shadow, particularly where you've got that stalk area at the top. And then there's like kind of veiny effect going on around here as well, so you can just add a few additional marks and that on here. And we've got a bit of a shadow happening on the bottom, so we can add that in as well in a minute. So I'm just going to go slightly darker with this orange, a bit of black with some more of the orange, add them together, get a slightly darker shade, and then start adding that in, and that'll start lifting. Now if you find when you're adding your colour over the top it's kind of disappearing, what that is the paint underneath is still wet. So let the paint underneath dry first, and then you can go in with a slightly different tone, and then it will pop, it will stand out more rather than it blending in. So I'm just adding a few extra areas here for the shadow. Like so. There we go. Now I'm going to do a little bit more defined lines on that, but I really want it to dry first. So I'm going to come down onto these bits here now and just put a little bit more shadow in on those edges to really make it stand out a bit more on this little pumpkin. There we go, and you can see those kind of ribs on the pumpkin standing out. Now I might actually add a little bit more yellow into this now that it's started to dry. So I'm going to go back in there with my bigger brush, reactivate that yellow. Now I'm not going to go in really heavy, it's quite watery, so it's just going to give me a nice hint of yellow without it being too overpowering. And I'm just going to add some of that in to warm it up a little bit, and you can see it just kind of warms up those colours that I've already got on the pumpkin. It just gives it a little bit more depth and interest really to your painting. Now it's hard sometimes to apply one layer over the other of watercolour without reactivating what's underneath and it messing it up. the key to it is just to make sure that when you put the next layer of colour on, it's not ridiculously runny and your brush isn't too wet. If your brush is too wet, then you'll end up with kind of lines and what they call like a cauliflower effect on your paint. So the key is to just take your time with it, don't rush it, and take off the excess. You can see here I've got a bit more yellow on the go, and I'm just wiping it on the side of my palette so that I've got colour, but it's not really wet, it's not really gloopy. And then I can just add in where I want it to go. On the watercolour. And that's giving it quite a nice yellow effect on there. Hopefully you agree. Hopefully you can see it okay on the camera. As I said, this is my first tutorial, so I hope it's coming through your end okay. There we go. And what I'm going to do, whilst I'm allowing all this to dry nicely, I'm going to actually start on this stalk here, which is like a kind of browny, sort of dark green kind of colour. So I'm going to start off with, now I need a little bit more ochre because hopefully you can see it, but just at the bottom of that stalk it's kind of like an ochre-y colour before it then goes up into the green. So I'm going to use my bigger brush, but just really carefully. I'm going to use a little bit of that ochre to begin with and just put that round the bottom like so, and then I'm going to introduce some green. Now this is sap green, it's called, from the Winsor & Newton range. It's just a nice and more natural looking green. I think sometimes certain greens can look very fluorescent or quite bright, and if you're trying to go with a green that's a little bit more natural looking, I find this one works really, really well. Whereas some other greens can look a bit too psychedelic. So, but that just comes with a personal preference, because actually you might like it looking like that, but also just experience of trying out the different colours and seeing what works. So what I've done there is I've just added a tiny bit of black to the green. You can see here I've just done it on the side because you really don't need a huge amount of paint to do this. So I've just added a tiny bit of black in with the green, and it's given me another shade of green, which is just slightly darker, and it's enabled me to now add slightly darker areas over the top of the green I put underneath. And I'm just dabbing on to give a bit of a texture to the stalk. And the top of the stalk here, where it's been cut, is like a lighter sort of beigey colour. So I'm going to use a little bit of this yellow ochre. And because I'm using it quite thinly, you'll get the kind of white of the paper coming through, so you don't need a huge amount on there to actually get the right effect. And I'm going to let that dry, and then I'm going to go over it in a minute with a darker green and pick out some of that detail. So now, however, because we've been working on this area, hopefully these areas here are nice and dry. So one way of testing is to stick your hand on it, but be careful, because if it's very, very wet, you'll lift the paint off on your hand, which you don't want to do. The other thing you can do is if you just slightly tilt your head and it catches the light, if it's shiny, it's still got water on the side of it, so just don't touch it. But if it hasn't got that reflection to it, then you know the paint's dry. So you can then go on in there and start adding your layers. And we're going to switch back over to that smaller brush. So I'll get my smaller brush again, get some water on there, getting ready. And I'm just going to start adding in some final details on these ridge areas and around the bottom here, just to make it stand out, make it pop. And I'm going to do that with some of the watered down black that I've got here. Start off a little bit lighter than you want, and then you can always get darker. And I'm just going to work from the back here and start adding in just some of that detail, and you can put in as much or as little as you want. if you were happy with it as it was a minute ago, leave it. You know, I think that's one of the hardest things actually, being an artist, is knowing when to stop. It can be quite difficult sometimes. And also sometimes when you see pumpkins and that on the telly, they've got perfectly straight lines on these ridges. This one has. This one is kind of a bit wobbly and a bit kind of bobbly in places. So have a go at trying to mimic that when you're painting those lines in. Don't have them perfectly straight. You can just add in some of that texture and that wobble, as it were, the technical term, of course. Add some of that in when you're actually doing your painting. There we go. And it's just giving us a little bit of definition around those little ridges. And hopefully that will start to make it pop out a little bit more. I'm going to add a few more lines here. And let the paint kind of work in your favour as well. So when you first put this paint on, because you've got a lot of paint on there, it goes on quite dark. But the more you paint, the less paint you're going to end up with, because it's all coming off of your brush. So what I mean by that is your colour on your brush is going to get lighter. So use that to your advantage. So if it goes to a slight grey colour because you haven't got as much paint on your brush, then use that in the areas that you want to have a little bit of grey, rather than having to then mix a separate colour and go from there. So I'm just adding a few little ridges on here because there's some ridged areas on the stalk, and a few little dots here and there just for a bit of texture. Same on the end here. Don't have to go too mad. That just gives it a little bit of texture. And then I'm going to make the green on the stalk just a little bit darker. So I'm going back to that sap green. It's got a tiny bit of black in it, but only a small bit. And I'm just going to use it to go over the top of some of the areas and make it a little bit darker. Like that. There we go. And it just gives you a little bit. And then you've got some of the light areas coming through. You've got some of the darker areas coming through. And hopefully it's starting to look a nice little pumpkin. And you can keep working at this all day long. You can just, and the nice thing about watercolours is it's like never ending. And what I mean by that is the fact that every time you come back, if you come back to this picture after 3 hours, 3 years even, and you put water on it and you start to reactivate the colours, you can keep working on it and keep adding to it. And that's what I like so much about watercolours, is the fact that you've got such nice durability to it. I like the transparency of colours. I like the effect that it has when you're painting. It is brilliant for doing wildlife. And I'm going to put some more videos on here. So if there's any particular wildlife or that you'd like to see me painting, pop it in the comments and then I can put some videos together. I'm wanting to do a lot more videos on here to share with you, just because I love painting so much. I absolutely love anything creative, to be fair. It's so good for your mental health, and I try and sort of get more and more people involved with it that I can, because I do think it's really good for you. Even if it's just 5 minutes at the weekend that you can sit down and do some colouring, or get your watercolours out and do some painting. It's that mindfulness. It just enables you to switch off and have a bit of me time, which we all know we don't do that enough of, but we should do it more. We really should. So what I'm doing now is I've just gone back to the orange that we had on the palette already. I've just put a little bit of black in there, And I'm just now going around this bottom edge and starting to put in a little bit more shadow and to make it look a bit more 3D. Because obviously if you're looking at light sources and things, my light is like over here, so it's coming from above really. And of course where the light can't touch is where you've got a nice bit of shadow happening. So that's what I'm trying to mimic on my painting. So I just thought I'd start adding in some shadows on there with a slightly darker orange colour, like so. And hopefully that'll start giving it even more depth. And then go a bit darker if you want a little bit more of a darker shadow around this very bottom edge here. A little bit more texture and shadow. And you can see how each time you go back in there, you're layering up those colours. And just slowly but surely getting darker and darker until you're at a point where you're happy with it. So I'm going back in there a little bit more orange again, so it's not quite so heavy on the black. Tiny bit of black in there, so I've got a nice sort of muddy orange colour. And just add a final, I reckon this will probably be about the last bit of shadow in along the edge. It's very quiet in my studio. I can hear my clock ticking very loudly. Apologies if you can hear it on the camera and it's driving you a bit nuts. I will have to take the battery out next time. So there we go. And I think we're about there. One little seasonal pumpkin. I hope you like it. If you have a go at this at home, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I'm Nikki. I set up my business UNikkiCreations 2 years ago, and so if you go on Instagram, if you go on Facebook and put in UNikkiCreations, and I'll put all the links and that underneath the video anyway, so you can find me. I've got a website and that as well, but if you follow me and that on there, and if you have a go at actually painting the pumpkin, pop me a message and show me, because I love to see what you've all been doing. So if you have a go at painting it, please do share, and it's just lovely for me to be able to see how you're doing, but also send me some feedback. You know, let me know what you liked about the video. As I said, it's my first one, so I'm very much learning here as we go along, but let me know, you know, was there anything that you found really helpful? Was there anything that you felt that I need to include? Because obviously every day's a learning day, and I can always constantly keep adding to these and making them even better. And as I said before, if there's anything in particular that you would really like to see me paint, so you can have a go at home, just let me know, and then I can put some more videos on. So don't forget to like and subscribe, and then yeah, show me your creations. I really look forward to seeing them. Bye.